everyone, and welcome to Making Opera Accessible, Opera Mariposa's first ever online panel, presented with the support of Creative VC and the City of Vancouver. I'm so excited to begin this important discussion about accessibility in the art form with these wonderful panelists. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. Opera Mariposa gathers on and acknowledges the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, from which we and several of our panel members come to you this afternoon. We are all grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this territory. We come together as well with panelists and supporting artists from coast to coast to coast, who acknowledge joining us from what is now known as New Westminster, the unceded territory of the traditional fishing village of Kikite First Nation, the traditional homelands of Blackfoot, Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, Tsuut'ina, Ayahina Koda nations, and the Métis nations, and from Takaranto, which is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and is land of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, including the Wendat people, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We come with respect for this land that we are on today and for the people who have and do reside here. Now I'd like our panelists to say hello. Just a few words, including your description and something of your background. Disclosure of specific disability or diagnosis, if applicable, is of course entirely up to each individual panelist. Now let's start with Karen.
Hello, I'm so honored to be here. My name is Karen Lee Morlang. My pronouns are she and her. I am a pianist, producer, and educator. I also work as the artistic director for Health Art Society of BC, where in a normal regular year, we would be producing about 750 professional arts performances across the province. And of course, this year we've had to adjust very much. For a visual descriptor, I am a Chinese-Canadian middle-aged female and wearing a bright purple jersey dress and surrounded by a digital piano, a grand piano, and an undecorated Christmas tree. Thank you.
Wonderful, welcome. Next is Ophira.
Hi, my name is Ophira Kaloff. I use both she, her, and they, them pronouns. And to give a bit of a visual description of myself, I'm a disabled, white, fat, femme-presenting human. I'm currently sitting in my power wheelchair and wearing a white and navy blue neck brace. And there's a plant over my shoulder that's a bit of a cactus looking. And for my background, my background is really very rooted in opera, and I trained for a bit in the University of British Columbia Opera Performance Program. And today I'm based in Toronto, and I work as a writer, performer, producer, and disability arts consultant through a bunch of different mediums, including music, comedy, theater, film, and indie arts communities. And I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Ophira. Next is Landon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Landon, and this is my name sign, which is two fingers just on the side of the head. And I'm here in the Dakota Valley, which is actually in Saskatchewan. It's a very small town. My goal is to be an ASL performer and director. I'm working on different types of forms of artwork in terms of what applies to me and how I can generate that work. My visual description is I'm currently wearing a long black sleeve shirt. I have my hair back in a bun. I'm in my 30s. I have 3 pieces of art behind me, and that's it. I'll take it back to you, Robin.
Thank you so much, Landon. Next is Stephanie.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Ko. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Chinese-Canadian woman with long black hair wearing a wine red dress. Behind me is a bunch of opera paraphernalia. I'm the general manager of Opera Mariposa, which is Canada's first entirely disability-led and run opera company. I'm bringing my perspective as a disabled arts administrator and specifically as someone who lives with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, which is a chronic neuroimmune disease, the onset of which can be triggered by a lot of viruses, including, unfortunately, coronaviruses.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's wonderful to have you. Next is Christy.
Hi, I am Christy. I use she, her pronouns. I am in front of my bookshelf. I am a white femme brunette woman. I've got braid and bangs, really large eyes, burgundy lipstick. I am a mentally ill and disabled choral singer. I also work behind the scenes for most of the indie opera companies in Vancouver. I'm kind of the person you call on to get anything done. I'm also a psychology student at Simon Fraser. I volunteer in various mental health care things. So I kind of like to joke, I have borderline personality disorder, severe anxiety disorders. I joke sometimes that I've gone from being a psych patient to a psych student. And that's kind of where I come from musically and health-wise.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christy. It's wonderful to have you here. And next is our guest panelist.
Hello, everyone. I am using an avatar today, so I will do a description of what is visually available. The avatar is the avatar is like fuchsia, but it's meant to be representational of the Black diaspora. I am of mixed racial heritage. The avatar has a large curly afro that extends to the shoulders, and it's on a light blue background. In terms of my background, I will say that I do live with disability. Invisible disabilities. And I certainly recognize the many intersectionalities that contribute to furthering decolonization practices. By that, I mean that we are a multitude of identities that interact with a multitude of systems of power and privilege. And as we delve into talking about how that relates to the arts community, I have an extensive background both as a performer and creator, and I work in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, commonly known as JEDI work, which is also fun to say. So I am a speaker and consultant on organizational change. I facilitate, and I do have an emphasis on disability justice, body liberation, and food justice work. And I'm very pleased to be here today.
Thank you so much to our guest panelist. And my name is Robin Hahn. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I am a brown-haired and brown-eyed white woman wearing 4 supportive silver ring splits on my fingers. I have my hair up in a ponytail and a gray sweater dress on today, in front of a background of a treble clef, some vintage opera posters and several plants and a bookshelf. And I am a queer and chronically ill opera singer, stage director, and vocal coach, and a co-founder of Opera Mariposa. It is so wonderful to have you here and to meet you all and to have this great conversation. So I want to start this conversation today with a little bit of focus on COVID and accessibility during the pandemic. We are some 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic now, and in several places around the world, opera houses and companies have already opened their doors with some precautions in place, while other regions, like BC, have gone into further lockdown. As we in North America begin to imagine what opera will look like going forward, I want to discuss some strategies that can help ensure that we aren't leaving anyone behind. So to begin, I'd like to pose to the group, why is it important to include higher risk, chronically ill, deaf, and disabled audiences and artists in the first place? Ophira, you're the first one.
I snuck it in. I think I always have an interesting time with this question of sort of why is it important? I think people often talk about the economic benefits. 1 in 5 people approximately live with a disability. But really, the reason that it's important to include, to me, I think, is because it's wrong to exclude. And we often think of the status quo as being neutral, but the status quo isn't neutral. The status quo is active exclusion. We're just very used to it. So we don't feel like we're doing that active exclusion. And so it's important to actively include because our alternative isn't acceptable. I don't think that many people would be comfortable saying, oh yes, we're comfortable making a whole art form actively exclusive.
Absolutely. The next person with their hand up is Stephanie. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, Ophira said some of the things I was going to say, both that it's the right thing to do and that about at least 20% of the population has one or more disabilities, but also that the number of people is actively increasing. Like, I think 80 to 85% of the disability community started out as non-disabled. And with COVID, for example, at least 1 in 10 cases are apparently having long-term health impacts. So if you look at the opera world, for example, statistically speaking, more and more members of the opera world will be needing to have, accessibility considerations going forward. So as we're planning for reopening, as we're figuring out how to do things, it's going to be more and more important to figure out how to do them in a way that's accessible and inclusive to everyone.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a great point, and it's a good thing to do, to be as inclusive and equitable as we can in all spaces. So, with that said, what are some important strategies during COVID-19 to make shows and content more accessible to all audiences? Stephanie, I'd like to throw this to you first, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Have you witnessed examples or implemented any yourself as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who's higher risk for COVID myself and who works in a entirely disability-run opera company. So I'd say a key method for Mariposa during COVID specifically was to aim to make programming safe for the highest risk or most vulnerable people first, and then to build up from there. Like, whether that means looking at specifically digital content or the most rigorous safety protocols or work processes. Like, we have pursued some musical activities since the pandemic started, and that's the approach we took. When we were looking at what mandates were in place, what public health guidance was in place, we'd take it and then we'd double it or we'd triple it. So we'd look at what tools were available and we wouldn't select which ones to use. We'd use all of them. So for example, we wouldn't just have physical distancing, we'd have physical distancing that was 27 plus feet because that was the largest amount for the studies we could find in terms of the distance aerosols could travel. We'd have N95 masks, we'd have HEPA filters with UVC sanitization, we'd have regular health screenings, we'd have COVID testing for anyone eligible to receive it under provincial health guidance. We'd have separate sanitizing kits for everyone, a dedicated safety officer, everything we could think of. And our rationale for this was that if we had sufficient risk mitigation for the highest risk individuals participating, then obviously it would be sufficient for everyone else too. And you can't always know who's higher risk, and they might not know themselves, or people might have individuals in their family who are higher risk, or people in their bubble. And then by arranging things in that way, it also reduces the need to pivot with activities or cancel them if the pandemic situation changes or new science emerges or provincial health guidance changes. And it also gave us access to a greater pool of talent because as there were people that we were able to work with who said they had not participated in any projects since March, since the pandemic started, but they felt confident working with us because of how stringent our protocols were. So, you know, that's sort of the approach we took because we didn't want to be in the position where we had to say, well, if you're too worried, just stay home. We wanted to only undertake and commit to doing things where we were comfortable. We had the capacity to undertake them in a way where people across the spectrum of risk were able to participate in them somehow.
Great, thank you. Our guest panelist had their hand up as well to add to that.
Yes, I do want to add to that piece, but I did want to speak just briefly to the previous question a little bit as well. And that being, why is it important to include higher risk disabled audiences and artists in the first place? I think that speaks to, the question for me speaks to a very ableist viewpoint that says, that kind of generates the question, where does art originate? And who is art meant to benefit? And who is looked to create art? When we recognize the ableist viewpoint and sometimes elitist viewpoint within certain art forms that do not embolden or encourage participation outside of very ableist spheres, that question then becomes relevant. But when we look at the fact that ableism is filtering the need for that question, and we recognize that ableism in itself needs to be challenged, then of course there's validity and great need for an equitable range of opportunities for creation, as well as audience experiences. The second piece around accessibility, as someone that has contributed to those types of safety plans, oftentimes there are elements of staffing, costs, or ideas put forward that say, well, what if so-and-so won't wear a mask and it conflicts with their access needs? And of course, working in disability justice, we will come across conflicting access needs. We have in our planning for this event today. And I think at this point, it is a larger conversation, but I'll just say that we have to move forward with empathy and with a lens of equity and justice, and recognize that there may be times when those conflicting needs can't exist on the same day or perhaps in the same performance. And then the point is from there to then decide, how will this get addressed and not just drop the ball? I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Landon.
Yeah, I think it's quite funny because I think in terms of the deaf community, they often tease hearing people because they're always speaking. And so therefore they're COVID spreaders, whereas we use our hands. And so we're not spreading those little droplets. Isn't that a conflict, eh? Anyways, I thought I'd mention that. But I do want to go back to your original question, Robin, that you were asking, why is it important to be inclusive for different disabilities? For myself, being a deaf individual, historically, we've been language deprived since the 1880s, and we still have not have legal rights for using sign language here in Canada. We still don't have it. It's a struggle. We've continued to lobby for those rights to recognize sign language as a language, and at the same time educate the public about our deaf culture, about the use of sign language, and the fact that it's a beautiful organic community that we live in, and we want to educate the public on what deaf theater means. And at the same note, how we talk to those members of the public and how hearing people try to lessen the barriers to involve deaf actors. And one of the ways and challenges is, of course, deaf people developing their own art forms, right? We've had to do that, but also trying to borrow our lenses of how we perform. And so, we have deaf-run theater with deaf, allies, as well as interpreters who support us in that process, which allows us to success. But we need to have allies in order to be successful. And I think the more successful we are, our rights will be recognized. So I think it's really important to value the Deaf Network in terms of our theater, what it means, what the impact it has. And at the same time, I think with the public, sometimes if we can have a deaf-led event with hearing people assisting us, it's much better rather than a hearing event where they have deaf substaff, because typically work has always been done in the public in a hearing cultural perspective and not a deaf perspective. And many deaf individuals sometimes don't even know how to work with a hearing person or a deaf person. And why do we have an interpreter here? Because none of the members here on the panel understand sign language. I can read and write English. I can communicate with you via that way. But really, the person that's having the most disabilities are the individuals who can't understand sign, right? That's why we have an interpreter, to make sure that we can kind of talk to each other. So we have to look at some of that contextual thinking and how we incorporate deaf-led productions and deaf-led projects. I think going back to your second question, deaf people really have not been exposed to opera. In fact, I've never, ever seen it. I've tried my best to learn it, to, develop my practice as an artist. Lots of challenges, but I'll give it back to you, Robin.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful panel. I'm so excited. You guys are fantastic. I wanted to ask, so these are great strategies, and I'm really excited to hear them from all of you. I wanted to ask, before we move on quickly, how do we think that these strategies that we use to make sure that everyone stays safe in this pandemic differ for larger versus smaller companies and organizations? I know that a lot of us have ties to smaller organizations or larger ones, and I was wondering what you might think about that. Yes, Karen. Oh, Karen, your mic is off.
Haha, my apologies. I just wanted to say how thrilled I am to be on this panel and to listen to all of you talk about your own lived experiences. So this is such a challenging time. It's been really tricky to adjust, and in particular, the organization that I work for part-time, we normally would be doing about 60 live concerts per month just in the province, Fraser Valley, Lower Mainland, interior, Kootenays regions. So what's been hard is that our audience are in healthcare sites, in long-term care homes, in hospitals, veteran centers, and this is exactly the most vulnerable demographic right now. So as of mid-March, we stopped all of that. But this is also the audience that has really needed art the most. And so we went from a very specific style of live performing to finding a way to switch to a digital medium. And then so not only did suddenly all our performers who are not really used to being recording artists or video artists have to learn and adjust and do it from our own living rooms, but then to find ways to deliver this to our audience. And of course, many of the care staff there were just so many different concerns, not to just even talk about, enriching what was going on in the daily lives right now. But of course, there were just so many logistical concerns. So that has been a big adjustment. And I have to say, all the colleagues that I recruited and worked with were amazing. Challenging, I would say, emotionally, mentally, to suddenly be recording opera, classical music, any form of music suddenly, and not having any response, because a big part of our work has been we play to cater to our audience, and so not having any response, just the cold camera as I smile at it, was challenging for all of us, but it's been a great learning curve. And so what's been difficult has been budget. Working with, we've had support, some amazing sponsors and funders, some governmental and some corporate and some private. But still, we are working with, a fancy iPhone, or we've recently been able to hire some wonderful videographers, but we are not a large organization. And so some of these larger organizations are able to put out these very fancy videos that cost $180,000 to produce 1 hour. And we're spending a small portion of that. And so it's a challenge to find a way to bring quality program. I think we've managed to do that, but it feels like sometimes like, oh boy, like I'm a little grain of sand trying to do my work and my art. It's a challenge. That's all I'll say for now.
All right, thank you. Ophira, you have your hand up.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say, as an indie arts producer, I strongly relate on the budget fronts, especially during the pandemic. Camera quality, microphone quality, lighting, etc. Never mind the cost of access measures and the time that it takes. But something that I've always found interesting in my work is, so I use the phrase "crypt the script," the idea of sort of centering a disability-led process throughout my work, and I create projects with no budget, like absolutely pulling it out of out of the air where I can, but access measures are the most important part of my budget constantly. So I've always found it interesting when I look at larger companies who do have more resources or access to more resources, and then I look around at all of the amazing disability-led work by individuals and small producers who manage to find the ways to make these strategies happen. And I just think it's worth noting that I think that some of it, I mean, money is a factor. You can't get around that. But I think for both small companies, large companies, and individuals, so much of it comes down to intention and priority. Because if that's the grounding, then every step you take is kind of done with that in mind. And that's kind of my hope for larger companies to take note as well.
Wonderful. Anyone else have something to add to that?
I think Landon had
Yes.
Yeah, Landon does.
Great. Go ahead, Landon.
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of Ophira, I really appreciated your point about the budget, because there's a big thing between projects and budgets, and the funding is always different, right? Sometimes you have to get a double budget when you're working with disabilities. And I think that the accessibility part of the budget needs to be separate from the actual production budget from the production. Because I know, like for myself, hearing people haven't figured out how do they separate the cost of an interpreter versus the actual production. And that's something that we've, had a lot of dialogue and discussion in terms of what our needs are and how we can proceed with projects. So I appreciate that, Ophira, that, projects obviously should have a separate budget from those that is the accessible budget. That's my experience, is that hearing people don't worry about the accessibility piece, but I'm like, wait a minute, but individuals who are, experience disabilities are going to get a reduced budget because they have to pay for these other accessibility features. And I think that, I've tried to educate a lot of people to say, look, I'm submitting 2 separate budgets, one for accessibility and one for the actual production. So thank you.
Wonderful. That actually leads me to my next question, which is about funding. Are there ways for artist advocacy groups like Actors Equity, for example, or funding bodies or policymakers to better advocate for underrepresented and higher risk artists or artists with any accessibility needs during the pandemic? How do they do that for us?
Landed here?
Landon, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry if I'm commenting too much. Just in terms of my personal experience, I've always volunteered my own time in terms of filling out grants, and then I take full accountability in terms of what I need. I make sure that I communicate very clearly with my funding body. And I think that way I have more control around the decision-making process when we do have the grants. And I separate, as I said earlier, my costs for interpreting and my costs for production, instead of relying on theater organizations and grants who don't have that experience to issue what kind of restrictions. So I'll go back to you, Robin.
Absolutely. Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie's
Sorry.
muted.
Yeah. Okay. I'm muted. And now I'm not muted. And then I think Karen. I was going to say that I think it's really good to have underrepresented individuals, people from the disability community involved as soon as possible in the policy making process. So before the grants are released, before the policies are released, in consultation. And I know a lot of funding bodies and decision makers do this, but I would also say not just having one disabled person in consultation, because we're not a monolithic group. My access needs aren't other people's access needs. Like our guest panelist said, when we were putting this event together, we found there was a great diversity of perspectives and needs. And, I know I learned a lot as we were creating this event. And so having a lot of different people from the community with a lot of different perspectives involved in putting things together, I think is really helpful in terms of figuring out how things could work for the community. I think is a really useful thing.
Yes, absolutely. The next person whose hand is up is our guest panelist.
I agree, Stephanie. And no, I say to Landon, please keep commenting. It's very valuable. I also sometimes get concerned for oversharing, so I share that with you.
Thank you.
I will say on the subject of accessibility for artists and arts workers, I mean, the very thing that we're doing here, which is pivoting to using online tools, has been something that we've all had to recognize and incorporate in different ways. What that then means in terms of like a paywall around what's being offered for audiences becomes a significant concern. Some organizations have put a lot of content out for free, and for some that won't work. But again, there's larger systems in play around those decisions, right? When we adhere to white supremacy culture and colonialist practices that value a certain level of productivity and a certain level of payment or compensation linked to, varying things, it becomes a framework through which certain decisions are made. It was a wonderful thing to see so many productions extend an element of trust in saying, here is a ticket, and then here's the button below where you can donate. And, recognizing that that may vary for people in terms of, their own life needs was also a piece of accessibility. So it's fluid on a lot of levels, but it is, and it does need to be said that we're pushing back against colonialism in a lot of ways. And when we look at these kinds of decisions, who's benefiting from holding on to practices that were exclusionary and designed that way?
Yes, absolutely. Karen, I think you had your hand up for like a brief moment there.
Yeah. I wanted to circle back a little bit to what Stephanie was saying, and I think Stephanie pretty much said most of what I wanted to say as well. But I wanted to add, having applied for grants, obviously, and also having been on some grant reviewing committees, I think I really noticed early on in looking for funders and help funding arts projects is when there's tokenism involved. And so when certain organizations are applying and you can tell they've wanted to be inclusive, but they actually haven't thought it out really well about what that actually means to be including this artist or several artists. And so like they've just kind of ticked off and said, yes, we've included such and such, but have not really thought it through. And that it's something that I'm hoping is going to change more and more, that we, organizations that might be looking for funding because they're used to relying on funding, and they're like, oh, now I have to do this to get this money. And you have to think about all else that comes from behind that. Why are we being more inclusive? It's because it's important, because 20% of our population, they need to be reflected back in our art. We want to see ourselves. We don't always want to see the same old that used to always take over. And sorry, I'm going to go on and on about this, but it really struck me in these last few years when I've either worked on grants or looked at grants that this was very common, and not everyone, I think, reads that carefully between the lines. And so we must ask people in power to be looking carefully, not only at the numbers and what they're saying, but what they are doing and who are they including, and are they really truly making out this space and creating the possibilities. I'm going to stop myself there.
No worries. We've got the space to play here. Christy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, like particularly with COVID, like a lot arts are always the first thing that gets cut. And as it is, budgets are usually tight, and a lot of times budgets are relying on, particularly in arts, they're relying on people to pay to access them because they don't get the kind of funding to, completely produce a show. They are usually relying on ticket sales. And as guest panelists mentioned, like when they do start adding in like an option to just watch it versus also buy the ticket, that becomes difficult for them. But then there's also obviously the issue of us actually, I'm on disability. I receive provincial disability, and that we are given we're under the poverty line. And, our costs have increased during the pandemic as, for example, we're trying to just access food. And it's already difficult for us to access art. And when, a lot of places are starting to try and figure out, like, where is our money coming from? If it's not coming from funding, it has to come from someone else. And trying to figure out, like, who's really paying for arts, and issues of equitable access when it comes to, ticket sales and making sure arts happen.
Absolutely. I myself feel really sort of strongly about this. I know of people who have searched for grants for things that, like in the past, pre-COVID, that would have, for example, been more accessible online. And with the standard repertoire of opera being, quite old, they've been rejected, these grants, with the intimation that they were not innovative enough, just putting on an old opera but making it accessible online. And now people are starting to get more of those types of grants because obviously COVID, but that it took COVID to imagine that this was an accessibility need, was frustrating. Because as we've discussed, it's a part of equity to be able to make it accessible and remove that barrier for people. I know that Mariposa has in the past offered live streams of operas, but those live streams, by their very nature, are not super high quality or whatnot. They're just us with our laptops pointing them at the screen because we want to make them accessible to our audiences, but haven't been able to get the funding to do so. Yes, guest panelist.
I wanted to piggyback on something that Christy had said, and actually something that you'd said, Robin, around COVID and COVID necessitating a certain broadening of perspective. And what we've also seen is that COVID, wherever there has been oppression or disenfranchisement, has increased that exponentially. So, you take a situation where there were these certain barriers pre-COVID, or as I like to call it, the time before. And then COVID comes into play, and it's, now 300-fold or more in terms of the seriousness, the gravity, and the potential solutions. When we look at a term like intersectionality, and we recognize that none of us are exclusively any one identity, you can't parse out the various needs that you have. It has to have a holistic view. And it also begs the question, like in terms of when you say arts budgets being the first to go, like where is art? How is art valued in society? If art mirrors what's taking place, we're going to have this whole generation of discussing elements like isolation and mental health and things that have been daylighted by the fact that people who may, as I think Stephanie mentioned earlier, consider themselves outside of the disability justice community are now recognizing things within themselves that maybe are linked to mental health issues that have not been addressed pre-COVID. And those that need to have information and to have support and to have access, right? Everyone is now facing elements of disability justice just by the sheer reordering of the isolation needs required to manage the most basic of COVID requirements. And as someone living with disability and immunocompromised, I have experienced a full range of isolation that I know I'm staggered by on some days.
Absolutely. Christy.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, like, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic and like the first 2 weeks, the sudden explosion of discussion about isolation and mental health. And for me, as someone who has been, put into certain levels of institutionalization for mental health, and hearing people suddenly talk about how, oh, you have to have people around, you have to be able to access the outside. Like, what will you do without arts? How could you live without arts? When, you know, in a lot of places where, like in hospitals, when you are hospitalized for mental health, it is deadly boring. It is horrifically boring, and there is nothing for you to do. There's no books. There's no, you know, we have a radio to play us music that we, you know, argue over what channel it's on, and definitely, certainly, you know, legally are forbidden from leaving. And so hearing people talk about how, oh, we can't go anywhere, what are we going to do, was definitely like, it was definitely an odd experience. And I think a lot of people who have, you know, lived in isolation because of disability, it's been kind of like a, yeah. um, I'm glad that you guys are cluing in now. I hope that you remember this when COVID is over and we all go back to living our lives, that like we are still, you know, sitting there in hospital bored to tears, the way that you were for those couple of weeks. And it does still matter that we be able to access these things.
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. Gosh, you guys are fantastic. I so appreciate this. These are great ideas and tools and things that the entire opera world, and in fact, the entire arts world, and in fact, the entire world should be keeping in mind as we move forward. I now would like to discuss a little bit of the wider world of opera and how the wider world of opera takes these ideas, concepts, and tools and uses them in the future in perpetuity in what I've been calling the after times. So I wanted to start by asking how do advocates make the case for continuing new accessibility practices post-COVID during a complete reopening, when we often face the structures and vocabulary that say going back to normal being going back to inaccessibility? All right, Stephanie.
Well, to borrow a phrase from someone who once gave me some very good advice, it doesn't really hurt to appeal to people's enlightened self-interest. So, I mean, I think most companies want to reach more audiences. They want more productive employees. They want to be able to draw from a broader pool of talent to cast the best people for roles. So, you know, if you can demonstrate that there are ways to do that, that are often relatively cost effective or free, you know, to adapt your processes, then if you can show that it works, then it makes sense to keep doing it, right? Like, um, so if you can show that there's a way to bring more audiences in, to bring the opera that you're doing to more people, to get more people interested in it, you know, then people will want to do that, I think. Uh, it seems like one of the big questions, even before COVID, that a lot of opera companies have been trying to sort of grapple with and focus group and everything is sort of how to keep opera vital and how to sort of like introduce it to more people and get new audiences and bring more people into the art form. And to me, one of the most obvious sort of answers to that right away is to bring down the barriers that are literally keeping people out.
Yeah.
Like from Opera Mariposa's perspective, the shows that we put on, some of them are sort of traditional operas. Some of them have a very explicit disability focus, and we are a more disability focused company overall. But I will say that the shows where we really center disability are consistently sold out. So, you know, it's very clear that the disability community is very hungry for shows that center us and for shows that are accessible. And for representation. So, you know, there is an audience there that wants to experience opera and wants, you know, wants to enjoy opera. So I think that's something that other opera companies could think about and consider. Yeah. Back to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steph. Karen, you had your hand up there for a
I don't know. I think Stephanie ended up saying it all again, which is great. Absolutely representation. And, you know, if I was to circle back to personal experiences, I think I might be one of the oldest artists here. So, you know, like just even auditioning as a young teenage singer for musical theater, being Asian back in that day, it was just so unusual to be auditioning and singing as in musical theater. It was just about impossible. And I sadly actually gave up because I felt like it was an uphill battle. And for me, I decided to choose a role as a pianist because that was more suited to what was acceptable and doable and workable and to be successful. And so now it's like I still get excited when I see, well, for my personal reasons, seeing an Asian singer on the operatic stage, not someone dressed up as an Asian singer, you know, in an Asian role or not, or even if there's no defining boundary, like why can't this character just look Asian, but doesn't have to be specifically Asian, right? I love those roles. I love, yeah, I'm passionate about the whole representation piece, and I think like what Stephanie said is that of 20% of our population and rising, we want to see ourselves on stage.
Absolutely. Ophira.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate so strongly with what both of you said. I was in the middle of my degree in opera performance when my disability started becoming more visible and much more present. And I remember the first day I got my neck brace and I put it on, and I hadn't been able to. Every time I sang, I lost consciousness for a while. It was very dramatic, especially as for an opera reference, I was learning the role of Antonia, who is a character who like sang, but it makes her sick. It was all levels of meta. Um, but within that experience, I put on my neck brace, and all of a sudden I could sing again. It stabilized my spine. And I remember for a moment being so excited that I could sing, and then realizing, oh, I'll never be able to be on stage with a neck brace on. I can't even wear my glasses in an opera. I've never been allowed to, not just because of the way the lights reflect on them, but because they're not accurate to the period. And so with that, and then I get my power wheelchair, and I'm like, well, that's certainly not era appropriate. I guess there's no way forward in this industry for me. And that's on the most surface level, right? That's on the presentational, what you can see in terms of casting. But there were so many barriers beyond that. The idea of how much stamina you need, your capacity, and all of that. And so I stopped singing opera, and I transitioned into other forms of art. I transitioned into writing, other forms of musical expression, and creating my own content because I saw absolutely no pathway for me. And so I keep thinking about, I wrote it down, Stephanie, when you said it, of how companies are searching for ways to make opera vital again. And I'm thinking, if something's vital, then the idea isn't, I mean, it's almost the same way we talk about any sort of important service of any kind. The conversation shouldn't be about how we can gain access to it, how we can prove ourselves worthy, how we can pay for it, how we can earn our right to it, but what it can do for us as well. Opera is such a huge umbrella with multiple senses and all of these different avenues of engagement. If COVID opens up this little window into seeing like, oh, we can do things about a little bit differently, we can find different ways of engaging with this art form. Why wouldn't we continue down that road? Yeah, that's where I'll end my thought for now.
Amen to that. Landon, you had your hand up briefly.
Mhm. Mhm. I think in terms of post-COVID, I think the theater company is going to see a paradigm shift. Now, mind you, it may be a slow thing. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact immediately. It will be quite slow. And the reason that I think of that is that because we're looking at the inclusion system, that's the problem that we have right now. It's those individuals who are the decision makers that are making decisions on behalf of others. And that's the problem that we have. In terms of, we've got the experience, we've got the lived experience, we've got the artistry, we have that compassion towards that. And I think in terms of post-COVID, we have to look at that system, and perhaps, that system will devolve. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but at some point, maybe that system can devolve and be reconstructed into a new area, for those individuals with lived experiences, those who are deaf, those are their disabilities. For myself, I remember in our internship with the Deaf Opera, we tried to, do as much work as we can. And we realized even with language production, opera is always been based on sound. And I was saying that we could do opera in a visual sense, right? Showing all the intonations, the volumes, through using a visual sensory tool as opposed to an auditory tool, and seeing how one experienced through your vision and through your eyes. That whole ocular visualization is what, I want to show people that they can do that. Now, I'm still learning. Obviously, I'm still, looking in a hearing public colonization type of world. But, I'm still learning. There's a lot of depth to decolonize, to uncompartmentalize, to look at what is expected, what is not expected. And that's my journey, right? And the system doesn't understand my journey. And that's something that I've been struggling with, but I'm still working within my practice and I'm still evolving. And I've got a long way to go. And yeah, it's frustrating because there is no formal training. And that's something we have to live through in terms of lived experiences. When I left Canada, I learned a lot about deaf theater. And I thought, oh my God, this is what it means. And then I tried to integrate it with music support and, different areas. And that I couldn't link it with just deaf and deaf, but actually having allies who could do the music for me to match what we were doing in our visual performance. So I think within the systems, we need to look at how they can change. What is the intent? Is your intent willing to give your power up and give power to others? And so, for example, deaf professionals, can we let go of that colonization because we've been so embodied of having hearing people take care of our work? But if this is our work, are you willing to let that go? And if you're not willing to let that go, then that's a waste of my time. And just another note that I just added in terms of deaf individuals already live isolated because 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, and hearing parents that do not learn sign language. My parents signed a little bit, but it was not enough to have full accessibility to communication. So our experiences, our lived experiences, we've already been growing up isolated. And then going into the theater is, a way that we're integrated with that. So I hope that my thoughts were clear for everybody else. And I'll go back to the next person there, Robin.
Perfect. We're just going to slide into the next topic because you guys provided such beautiful transitions for me. Opera is wonderful. It's my favorite thing in the whole wide world. It's also full of ableist structures and stories. I'm just as an example, I want to talk a little bit about mad scenes. They are the musical centerpieces of many of our favorite operas, but they also often frame mental illness as violent, deadly, or easily curable by outside intervention, the killer cure trope. Just as an example, So I'd like to throw this to Christy first, but there are other types of structural inequities, obviously within opera as a whole. But I want to ask in general for everyone as well, how does opera, which is an art form so rooted in centuries of tradition and therefore of many problematic tropes, embrace the future of storytelling, particularly against a backdrop that we have right now of a global reckoning with these systemic inequities?
Yeah, so starting on Mad Scenes, I would just first like to add in a bit of content warning for anyone watching this. There, as part of Mad Scenes, we are going to be talking about like suicide, issues of that. I'd also like to address even just the term Mad Scenes. Mad is actually an identity that is reclaimed by some people, similar to the way that many of us on the panel would consider ourselves disabled. And I share many experiences with those who identify as such. I've been certified, or what you would call committed, involuntarily for treatment. I've been restrained, mistreated, faced stigma, many of that thing. And I'm certainly not ashamed of my history, but I don't actually identify as MAD. It's very closely related to anti-psychiatry, which is not something I personally consider dangerous. I identify as mentally ill, psychiatric disabilities, but I tend to be involved in, person-focused healthcare reform that takes more of a recovery lens. But looking at the Mad Scenes, I think, all of us know that they're problematic, particularly the way that they are gendered as being primarily a, feminine hysteria, the way that, obviously you said, violence is my least favorite representation of mental illness because it's so common, despite the fact that the majority of mentally ill people are more likely to experience violence than to actually commit any violent acts. And it's just, it's a constant. And a lot of people with mental illness may not face that, but certainly for those of us who have been treated as inpatients, people are terrified of us. In the hospital, we had delivery people who freaked out and didn't want to come up to our floor when they realized that they were delivering to a psychiatric ward. They were just terrified to even be in a room with a bunch of us. But when I watch these scenes, I'm a woman. I have borderline personality disorder. So, the way that these women will go from seeming, sane to, suddenly threatening or attempting suicide is fairly reflective in many cases of my experience. And, I've been stared at by people while my hair and clothes are a mess. While I'm sobbing, screaming, staring off into space, dripping blood. I've never murdered, to be clear, my blood. Even my disorder under the DSM is grouped as a dramatic disorder because it's, characterized by extremely intense, painful emotions, which are what Mad Scenes are famous for portraying, is that extremely intense emotional experience. And in many ways, this is a problem. BPD is extremely stigmatized, even by medical professionals. And I think a lot of it is because we are so similar to a lot of these women that you see in operas. And we're accused of essentially, being prima donnas who are being overly dramatic to get attention. So it's really hard, certainly, do I think we should continue this trope when we write new operas? No. Obviously, we need more complex, more representative, non-violent examples. If I wasn't borderline, I have another 5 or so disorders. I don't see those on stage ever. But the ones that we do have, do I think we should stop performing them completely? I personally would say no. I think that if we get rid of them, that shuts down conversations like this. And I know as a musician, I was a flute player, actually, not really a singer. I have a hypermobility condition, so I stopped being able to play like a couple of the others. That ended my career. But for example, Lucia de Lammermoor, I love the way that she interacts with the flute there musically. If I had a chance to do that, I would, if I had my hands back, I would absolutely love doing that. But I just would want to see, new operas coming out, not doing these same tropes. And certainly the old ones, when they're being performed, they really need to be contextualized for an audience in terms of like a history of depictions and understandings of mental illness. Sorry, that was really long. I have a lot of, yeah.
No worries. That's what we are here for. Yes, absolutely. I agree completely. I think that opera is a world where we have this standard repertoire that goes back so long, and that that is a rich thing to pull from, knowing its problematicness, and that if we're presenting all of these things in context, with talks, real information, real resources for people, with engagement with the people that these stories are about. Nothing about us without us. We're in the best possible situation. I think Karen had her hand up before our guest panelist did.
Very briefly, in response to Christy, I guess just an interesting side perspective. My dad is a retired psychiatric nurse. And so he moved from Hong Kong to Canada, kind of like the first immigrant of a very large family. So there were a lot of language barriers, though he speaks English. But to me, it was always very fascinating growing up that I think it was a tough adjustment. And he was not always willing to talk very straightforwardly with me about his work. And for me, possibly because I was always such a big fan of opera from early on, and with these strange, these representations, as we're talking about, problematic. So I was interested. And now in my work, I visit psychiatric wards quite frequently. And I have to say that the audiences that I play for are among the most amazing, receptive audiences, where music is absolutely so needed. And many of the patients have been the most educated, enlightened, and compassionate people I've met. And I want to help break down that barrier also, of the fact that people, as you said, are scared or like steer away because of what they assume. And so I think also in newer operas that are being written, and hopefully in ways of reinterpreting old opera, if we so choose, that we need to build in much more depth and find ways to have all those layers in our interpretation if we reuse those operas. That wasn't short, was it? Sorry.
No worries. Guest panelist, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say a few things that piggybacked on what Christy was sharing, but I guess it connects to the larger conversation about about mad scenes or crypt culture, and how we as a society position ourselves around things that are deemed unacceptable in terms of perpetuating racialized or other biases. These things often get polited away with terms like tradition. Tradition is not a be-all excuse. It is not something that I would put forward as an acceptable rationale for harm. I think that when we look at how language is steeped in, whose language are we using, right? Whose language am I using? I'm using a colonizer's language to try and describe even what I'm saying right now. But I do not believe that because something has always been done, that it justifies it continuing to be done. And when I listen to Ophira talk about the constraints or prohibiting any kind of modern aid device, that is not acceptable. Then that's not the production to do. Is it that we're worried that audiences won't come if the so-called classics aren't done? Is it that we're worried that there won't be financial support if this all-encompassing, harmful guise of tradition isn't upheld? We need to ask better questions, and we need to become less accepting of perpetuating harm in whatever ways. Decisions need to shift. We need to stop perpetuating harm. We can't just look at it and say it's okay because. We need this here because. And that's what these types of decisions call to mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Landon's hand was up a little bit before Christie's, and then we'll, real quick, if we can, so we can get all these important things in just before our little deadline there. Go ahead.
Sure, I will try to be as quick as possible. I just wanted to say that I really liked the comments about language and its influence. I remember doing a workshop on ASL opera, which there was no written form of it. We were only doing it in the visual language, of course. And then, of course, we had sound. And it was interesting because I had a theory that hearing people had a little bit more flexibility with other visual artists, which was neat. But deaf people had already been deprived of music or anything else in their whole lives. They didn't have the visual training to look at art. And so I want to make sure that we're not overshadowed, because when the hearing person is singing opera and they're beside the deaf individual who's signing, the deaf audience has obviously a visual space. They're going to look at the deaf individual, not necessarily the singer. And so it's hard for the hearing person to break their habit and be overshadowed, right? And so again, seeing that impact, it really changed the public's persona on sign language and then on oral language. And so, with my experience is very different in doing that. But ASL is still a language. And I guess sometimes I considered with myself is that when people do go to Germany, or they listen, or they say they go to a German opera, they don't understand it, right? They don't speak German. They're not going to understand the opera, but they can still enjoy the show. Why can't deaf people and other audiences do the same thing? Come to an ASL opera, even though they don't understand sign language, but still appreciate that the language is being expressed in a different modality.
Absolutely. Christy, real quick.
I think I lost my sort of train of thought.
No worries. That's
Partially,
totally fine.
I sometimes think about the fact that, mental illness is probably the best attested disability among some of the composers. So I think sometimes for me, it's not always coming from an outsider perspective, the way that, for example, a lot of the really, really icky racial things that come up in opera are 100% coming from, white composers. So it's definitely difficult when approaching these as well to look at, obviously who's writing them, and making sure that it's always difficult. And certainly when you get into issues of tradition and wanting to, certainly not perpetuate any kind of harm. Always, it's difficult calls to be made, and absolutely, sorry, I'm losing trains of thought here.
Totally fine. Yeah, I agree. And from an opera singer's perspective, there's so much of this wonderful standard repertoire that we love, that is our bread and butter, that we pull back out, and that's how we make our money. And there's this belief that I encounter among opera directors as well, because as I said, I'm also a stage director, that to do those pieces, you must do what has always been done. And that's completely untrue. You can cut out large bits that are gross. You can see, oh, look, there's an implied joke that is not appropriate and is harmful. And I can put a different joke here. There's a ton to be done that I feel like we meet a lot of resistance to in opera. And that is in the spirit of the opera in the first place. For example, Nozze di Figaro is a very irreverent piece that for its time would have been very progressive. It is in the spirit of Nozze di Figaro to take out the harmful jokes. And you can do it really easily. It's not hard. Yes. So
I feel like people are more willing to like put people in modern costumes than they are to like let someone sing in a neck brace or skip a joke. Their interpretation of what is traditional is based on a very, as long as they're abled or whatever, then that's traditional. But the moment you bring in people who, according to them, have never been there when we've been there the entire time, that's when they suddenly bring up, oh, it's not realistic. Oh, we can't have the audience, suspend disbelief because she's wearing a neck brace when there's magic going on, or they've got an 18th century opera with people in modern clothing. Like, what is your tradition that you think is important here versus what we're talking about?
Exactly. I have a question now. Thank you so much, everyone. I do have a question specifically for Landon here. I'd like to ask you a question, because we've been talking mostly about ableism so far in this little section.
Oh my God, I'm scared.
I just wanted to discuss with you another form of oppression, audism, or discrimination against deaf people. Opera has long been a very audio-centric arts practice, despite benefiting from the talent of deaf composers like Beethoven, whom we should note is of African descent as well, and the participation of deaf and hard of hearing creators, performers, and patrons. So I wanted to ask you how the opera sector can better engage with the deaf community, and what benefits there are for the hearing community in opera in exploring the intersection of deaf arts, and opera.
Okay, my simple answer is that it has to be deaf-led. It definitely has to be deaf-led. Because music is actually universal, and we have to make sure that it's deaf-led so that the music can match every form of the hand shapes, the depth of it, and to look at how we create it. So music has to be designed to match the movements that we have in sign language in order to accommodate that. So my first and foremost answer is it has to be deaf-led. There's no other way to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Now, in general, let's merge these ideas. How do systemic ableism and audism currently affect things like education, hiring practices, and audience engagement? And how do we start to dismantle those barriers in opera? Let's talk about systemic ableism and audism. Stephanie. Oh, Steph, your mic is off.
Darn it. Okay. my perspective on this is a bit atypical because we started Opera Mariposa partly so we could accommodate our particular access needs, though I should note we did have to start our own company to do that. But I mean, there's ableism at all levels of our society, obviously, but I should note as an engager, I do see a particular type of issue quite a lot where I get told by artists a lot where they have a particular access need or a health situation, which isn't necessarily chronic. It could be quite temporary or any sort of concern. And they tell me it has to be kept very confidential, not because it's their personal preference or because of any logistical consideration, but because they are very, very worried about discrimination in the industry. Like they're worried that if anyone else finds out, they'll be considered unemployable. And they clearly are employable because they're getting employed, right? Like they are employable because they're doing the work. But it just, like, to me, that's not okay. But that's the current situation as things stand. And the other thing I've observed a lot as an engager is at the start of a process, we usually ask people, you know, what their access needs may be. And we're very open about the fact that the reason we do things a certain way is because we have certain access needs ourselves. You know, we're very out about being disabled. But generally, well, it varies, but I've found a lot of artists are not just hesitant to ask for anything. I would characterize it as petrified. Like, and not just anything that's really elaborate or really expensive. Things that are free, not any trouble for us that they could bring ourselves, that cause no inconvenience and take no time. They're just really, really scared of being labeled troublemakers for basically having good communication. And to me, that's very indicative of what they may have encountered in the past, like what, you know, in elsewhere in the industry or what might be the norm. I mean, I don't know what the solution to that is, other than maybe really normalizing, you know, having a variety of access needs, having that asked about in different processes, having more visibility in terms of people having a variety of access needs, people in positions of power, decision makers, engagers, being open about having their own if they're so comfortable with that, you know, like visibly disabled people being out, maybe tackling very overtly some of the stigma and some of the misconceptions about people with disabilities working in the industry, like the idea that people who like that disabled people wouldn't be employable as artists because clearly they are. There are loads of them. They're just scared to say they're disabled because they're worried they wouldn't get hired again. But yeah, that's just something I've observed. And as an engager who engages both disabled and non-disabled people, I want to say that every artist is an individual, obviously, and every artist needs to be suited to whatever role you're casting them in. But speaking in broad generalities, I would say that the disabled artists I've worked with are at least as reliable as the non-disabled artists I've worked with. And maybe that's because it takes an exceptional level of commitment and adaptability and preparation to make your way in a very barrier-filled industry as an artist who has a chronic illness or disability. But yeah, so I think we need to sort of tackle that stigma.
Absolutely. Ophira, your hand was up.
Yeah, I mean, oh goodness, I could go on forever about education, rehearsal processes. There is so much there. And I think a lot of people have touched on bits before. But I just want to say that the reality is that I can't do everything that I used to be able to do. My disability has been progressive. My capacity is different. I can't stand for long periods of time. I am ambulatory, but it can't happen. I do need more rest than the average person. These things are realities. I now have a hard time reading sheet music. Whereas at school, I was taught that the only way to learn things was through sheet music, that to learn it through auditory means was unacceptable. But that's the way that works for me and my body. And I think it's really important to note that there is no one way for someone to be an opera performer. There's no one way for someone to be an audience member. There's no one way for anyone to engage with this art form. The cool thing about opera is that there's so many different ways to engage because it's such an all-encompassing art form that spans so many senses and mediums. And I think that shift is hugely important for there to be a future. I think that's something we can learn from disability arts. Instead of thinking about how do we make space for, or how can we accommodate disabled performers into a normative opera world, how do we make the opera world, or how do we transition and bring opera to a cool crip art space with all of the amazing techniques and processes that already exist and have been developed by elders throughout many generations of deaf, mad, and disabled folks. And that's where I'll end that.
Great, thank you. I am so sorry, Christy. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to move into our very last question really quickly. Hopefully, that we could sum up your point there as well. It takes us really organically to the final question, the major question. There are those within operatic systems who resist changes to traditional operatic storytelling and practices, as we've been discussing. What would you say to those people to help them embrace positive change? Stephanie. Oh. Stephanie, you're on mine.
Yep. Okay. That's what I was just checking. I would try to find common ground with them, like find out what they're passionate about and go from there. Like if someone's staunchly traditional, they're probably very attached to the art form as it is. So, we can agree that there are great things about opera. And so I would say like, well, don't you want even more people to appreciate opera and what you love about it? Why don't we figure out how to get even more people to become opera converts, right? And so I'd sort of go from there. And I'd say, that opera in its time when it was first created was an amazing innovation, combining existing ingredients from like classical drama and court entertainments and stuff into something that was new. And a lot of the great classical composers they probably love were innovators and were really creative and different. And that's why their work lives on today. So if we want to build on these great things that we've inherited, then we have to keep creating and building on that. So, not everyone's going to have the same exact idea of what opera is. And that's okay because opera has a lot of room for a lot of different voices.
Yeah. All right, Christy and then Landon, and that is where we will have to leave it for today. Go right ahead, Christy.
Yeah, I think, going back to, as guest panelists and I were talking about tradition, one could say, people will tell you that I have a very traditional sense of musical taste. I love the Baroque period, historically informed performance. When I was a flute player, the modern pieces, I was just not into those like extended techniques and things that you get in the more modern music. But when it comes to issues of tradition, to me, the music is more important than these things. And also when people are thinking about tradition, like my other background is in archaeology, and people are constantly saying like, well, if you include like gay people or trans people or disabled people or people of color, like they didn't exist back then. And I'm like, actually, we've been here the whole time, like thousands, millions of years. We've been here the whole time, and we've been there the whole time in opera. Just, you know, as Stephanie said, not willing to say it. And people imagine the past is far more traditional than it ever really was. You know, a lot of our composers were gay, a lot of them were mentally ill, you know, had different disabilities. So the idea that it's like new and going to ruin the art form, well, it hasn't managed to ruin it in the last several hundred years. So I'm not sure how including more of it on stage is going to suddenly destroy opera overnight.
Absolutely. And Landon.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really crucial to have hearing allies, those who really understand the system. I would not be here if it was not for Dee Wong from Renaissance with Renaissance Opera, because really lobbied hard for me to have a deaf person be part of opera. You really have to have a strong advocate in order for me to be able to pursue the artistic profession.
Wonderful. I thank you so much. We are out of time, but I'm sure all of us have so many opinions. We could talk about this for eons more. I want to thank everyone, panelists and attendees alike, for joining us for Making Opera Accessible. It's been a joy and like super informative. I'm so happy. Thank you once again to Creative BC and the City of Vancouver for supporting Opera Mariposa for today's panel. For more information on all of our panelists and their amazing work, you can visit operamariposa.com. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.